In the shadows of human history, long before our modern understanding, cannabis stood not as a controversial substance, but as a revered messenger between worlds. The ancient civilizations that first cultivated this remarkable plant didn't see it through our contemporary lens of recreation, or even medicine. They recognized it as something far more profound, a sacred key that unlocked the doorways to divine consciousness. Archaeological evidence from sites dating back over 10,000 years reveals cannabis residue in ceremonial vessels across multiple continents, suggesting a universal recognition of its spiritual significance that transcended geographical boundaries. In the misty highlands of ancient China, shamanic practitioners of the earliest Taoist traditions burned cannabis seeds and flowers in elaborate bronze censers, believing the rising smoke carried their prayers directly to ancestral spirits and celestial deities. These weren't casual practices. They were the foundation of humanity's earliest organized spiritual systems. The Vedic traditions of ancient India perhaps held the most profound relationship with cannabis. In sacred texts dating back to approximately 2000 BCE, the plant appears as bhang, described not merely as vegetation, but as a divine gift bestowed upon humanity by Lord Shiva himself. The Atharva Veda lists cannabis among the 5 most sacred plants on earth, referring to it as a source of happiness, joy giver, and liberator. When consumed as part of carefully orchestrated rituals, it was believed to cleanse worshippers of sins and unite them with the cosmic consciousness that permeates all existence. What makes these ancient relationships with cannabis particularly remarkable is the sophisticated understanding these cultures maintained about its proper spiritual application. Far from recreational use, the consumption of cannabis in these contexts followed strict protocols, specific preparation methods, appropriate times of day or astronomical alignments, precise dosages, and accompanying prayers or mantras that were considered essential to properly directing the experience towards spiritual awakening, rather than mere intoxication. In ancient Scythian cultures spanning from Eastern Europe to Central Asia, funeral rites incorporated cannabis in rituals designed to guide the deceased through the transition between worlds. Herodotus, the Greek historian, documented these practices in approximately 450 BCE, describing elaborate tent structures where mourners would gather to inhale the sacred smoke as part of their communion with departing souls. The Scythians believed cannabis smoke created a bridge between the visible and invisible realms, allowing momentary glimpses beyond the veil that separates life from the great mystery that follows. The ancient Assyrians knew cannabis as kunubu, a term that some scholars believe is the etymological root of our modern word cannabis. Their priests used it specifically for its ability to induce what they called the fire of prophecy, a state of heightened awareness where future events could supposedly be glimpsed and interpreted. Temple inscriptions describe cannabis as the plant that reveals the pathway forward, indicating its crucial role in divinatory practices that guided everything from military campaigns to agricultural planning. Perhaps most striking about these historical relationships with cannabis is how they contrast with our modern understanding. These cultures didn't view cannabis as a means of escaping reality, but rather as a tool for encountering a deeper reality that ordinary consciousness couldn't perceive. The plant wasn't used to disconnect from spiritual responsibility, but to enhance connection with the divine order. In the Zoroastrian tradition, cannabis was included in the preparation of haoma, a sacred beverage described as expanding the user's mind 70 times beyond ordinary perception, not to induce pleasure, but to grant wisdom otherwise inaccessible. This understanding of cannabis as a sacred intermediary between human consciousness and divine wisdom wasn't limited to the ancient world. Indigenous tribes across the Americas incorporated cannabis and related plants into their ceremonial practices, always within structured contexts that emphasized respectful engagement with the plant's spirit. Rather than viewing themselves as consuming a substance, these traditions approached cannabis as entering into relationship with a teacher, one that could reveal hidden dimensions of reality when approached with proper reverence. What has been lost in our modern discourse is this profound sense of relationship, the understanding that cannabis might be more than a chemical compound affecting brain receptors, but potentially a botanical ally that co-evolved with humanity precisely to facilitate expanded awareness. The transformation of cannabis from a ritualistic element to a profound medicine of the soul represents one of humanity's most significant yet overlooked spiritual developments. While modern science focuses on cannabinoids and their physical effects, ancient healing traditions recognize something far more profound: cannabis as a catalyst for spiritual healing that operated beyond the material realm. In the ancient healing temples of Egypt, cannabis preparations known as esemsem were administered not merely to address physical ailments, but to facilitate what hieroglyphic texts describe as the restoration of the ka, the spiritual essence or soul force believed to animate the physical body. Priests of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of healing, carefully prepared cannabis infusions according to lunar cycles and astrological alignments, believing these cosmic factors enhance the plant's ability to reconnect patients with their divine blueprint of perfect health. Medical papyri dating to approximately 1550 BCE detail specific applications where cannabis was prescribed not for pain or inflammation, but explicitly for conditions believed to originate from spiritual imbalance. What modern medicine might diagnose as psychological disorders, the Egyptian healers understood as disruptions in the soul's natural harmony, and cannabis served as the bridge to re-establish that essential connection. Patients would enter meditative states facilitated by cannabis, guided by temple healers through visualizations designed to dissolve energetic blockages, preventing the flow of life force. This understanding of cannabis as soul medicine expanded dramatically throughout the ancient world. In the mystery schools of Greece, particularly those dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine, initiates underwent elaborate healing ceremonies where cannabis was administered alongside carefully choreographed sensory experiences. Specific music frequencies, color therapies, and aromatic compounds, all synchronized to amplify the plant's ability to open the eyes of the soul, as preserved writings describe it. What these mystery schools understood was that true healing often required journeying beyond ordinary consciousness to access the causal realm where illness first manifests before appearing physically. Cannabis served as the vehicle for this inner journey, allowing initiates to perceive the subtle energetic patterns underlying their conditions and participate actively in their transformation. Unlike modern passive approaches to medicine, these traditions viewed healing as a collaborative process between patient, plant, and the divine intelligence that flows through both. In the Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhist tradition, cannabis was incorporated into specific meditation practices designed to accelerate spiritual development. Texts preserved from the 8th century CE describe cannabis as that which removes the veil, referring to its ability to temporarily dissolve the perceptual boundaries that separate individual consciousness from universal awareness. Highly trained practitioners used precisely measured amounts of cannabis, not for escape, but as a skilled means of recognizing the illusory nature of the separate self, the fundamental insight that Buddhism identifies as the gateway to liberation from suffering. The Sufi mystics of the Islamic world similarly integrated cannabis into their spiritual pharmacopoeia, referring to it as the herb of understanding. Particularly within certain branches of the Qalandar Sufis, cannabis facilitated the ecstatic states of union with the divine that characterize the highest expressions of Islamic mysticism. Their practices involve consuming cannabis and then engaging in rhythmic breathing, movement, and chanting designed to direct the expanded awareness toward dissolution in Allah's infinite presence. Far from recreational use, these were disciplined spiritual technologies aimed at transcending the limitations of the ego-bound self. Perhaps most sophisticated were the cannabis healing methodologies preserved in ancient Indian Ayurvedic medicine. The classical text, Anandakanda, devotes an entire chapter to cannabis preparations, describing them as nectar that removes the veil of ignorance. Ayurvedic physicians recognized specific spiritual indications for cannabis administration, including what they termed soul loss, conditions where trauma or difficulty had caused aspects of the patient's essential nature to become dissociated or suppressed. Cannabis ceremonies conducted by skilled practitioners were designed to create the conditions for these fragmented aspects to be recognized and reintegrated, restoring wholeness on all levels of being. What unified these diverse approaches was the understanding that cannabis could serve as a catalyst for accelerated soul development when used within appropriate contexts. Unlike casual consumption, These traditions embedded cannabis use within comprehensive systems of spiritual development that included ethical guidelines, dietary protocols, specific practices before and after administration, and the crucial element of skilled guidance. The plant was viewed not as an end in itself, but as a sacrament that temporarily adjusted the receiver's consciousness to perceive and interact with healing energies normally beyond ordinary awareness. The spiritual potency of cannabis as soul medicine derived precisely from its ability to temporarily dissolve the boundaries of the conditioned self, creating an opening through which higher awareness could enter and transform the individual. As one preserved Essene text described it, the sacred herb does not bring wisdom that was not there before. It removes the obstacles preventing wisdom from flowing naturally. The ancient healing applications of cannabis thus operated from a fundamentally different paradigm than our modern understanding, one that recognized consciousness itself as the primary healing force in the universe, with the plant serving as a means of accessing expanded states of consciousness where accelerated healing, insight, and transformation become possible. The relationship between cannabis and the feminine divine represents one of the most profound yet systematically erased aspects of humanity's spiritual heritage. Long before cannabis became associated with masculine counterculture movements or recreational use, it held a revered position in goddess-centered spiritual traditions across the ancient world, recognized specifically for its ability to awaken intuitive wisdom, fertility, and protective qualities associated with feminine spiritual energy. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian sites dating to approximately 4000 BCE reveals cannabis offerings prominently featured in temples dedicated to Ishtar, the powerful goddess of love, fertility, and war. Clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform describe cannabis as the herb of Ishtar and detail specific ceremonial applications where priestesses would consume carefully prepared cannabis infusions before entering prophetic trance states. These women weren't merely passive channels but skilled spiritual technologists who used cannabis specifically to amplify their connection to the goddess's wisdom, which was then interpreted to guide everything from agricultural timing to matters of state. The Egyptian goddess Seshat, patroness of writing, record-keeping, and mathematics, intellectual domains we now mistakenly associate primarily with masculine energy, was consistently depicted with a cannabis leaf as her crown emblem. Temple paintings show female initiates of Seshat's mysteries consuming cannabis preparations before engaging in complex astronomical calculations and architectural designs, suggesting that the plant was understood to facilitate the feminine capacity for multidimensional awareness essential to these disciplines. Far from being merely decorative, these artistic representations encoded sophisticated understandings of how cannabis activated specific feminine cognitive capacities valued in Egyptian spiritual science. Perhaps the most explicit connection between cannabis and feminine spirituality appears in the ancient tantric traditions of India. The sacred text Tantrasara explicitly identifies cannabis as an embodiment of the divine feminine principle Shakti, the primordial creative energy of the universe personified as goddess. When properly prepared as Vijaya, the victorious one, cannabis was understood to temporarily awaken the dormant Shakti energy at the base of the spine, facilitating its rise through the subtle energy centers to unite with the masculine principle of consciousness at the crown, a spiritual process believed to grant profound insight, healing, and eventually liberation. This understanding wasn't abstract theology, but applied spiritual technology. Women serving as lineage holders in tantric traditions specialized in cannabis-facilitated healing ceremonies designed specifically to address conditions believed to stem from disconnection from the divine feminine, including creative blockages, fertility challenges, and the spiritual malaise that results from living in societies that systematically devalue feminine wisdom. These priestesses maintained sophisticated knowledge of specific cannabis strains, harvest times, and preparation methods that emphasize particular effects aligned with different feminine divine qualities. The connection between cannabis and feminine spiritual energy extended into the realm of protection. The Norse goddess Freya, associated with beauty, fertility, and prophetic vision, was invoked through ceremonies involving cannabis consumed by female seers known as vulva. These powerful spiritual practitioners would enter cannabis-facilitated trance states to perform Seder, a form of magic specifically focused on weaving protective energetic shields around individuals, families, and communities. The cannabis plant was understood to amplify the protective qualities of feminine energy, creating boundaries that prevented harmful influences from affecting those under the vulva's spiritual care. What made these feminine cannabis traditions particularly powerful was their emphasis on relational consciousness, the understanding that proper engagement with the plant required establishing an ongoing relationship with its spirit rather than simply consuming a substance. Women serving as keepers of these traditions taught specific protocols for harvesting that included offerings, prayers, and expressions of gratitude that acknowledged cannabis as a conscious ally rather than an inert material. This relational approach reflected core feminine spiritual values that recognized interconnection and reciprocity as fundamental cosmic principles. The systematic suppression of these feminine cannabis traditions began with the rise of patriarchal religious systems that viewed women's autonomous spiritual authority, particularly involving visionary plants, as threatening to male-dominated power structures. By the medieval period in Europe, the Catholic Church's witch-hunting manuals explicitly targeted women who maintained knowledge of cannabis and other sacred plants, often conflating their legitimate spiritual practices with demonic worship to justify brutal persecution. This deliberate campaign not only eliminated countless female spiritual practitioners, but effectively severed Western culture's connection to this ancient body of feminine plant wisdom. What remains particularly striking about these historical traditions is how they contrast with contemporary cannabis culture, where modern usage often emphasizes cannabis as an escape or purely recreational substance. These feminine spiritual traditions approached it as a means of becoming more fully present, more deeply embodied, and more consciously engaged with both inner wisdom and the natural world. The plant wasn't used to numb or disconnect, but to enhance sensory awareness, intuitive capacity, and the ability to perceive subtle energetic patterns, all qualities associated with the divine feminine in various spiritual systems. The recovery of these forgotten connections between cannabis and feminine spirituality offers profound implications for contemporary seekers. It suggests possibilities for engaging with the plant not merely as a substance, but as a spiritual ally specifically attuned to awakening feminine wisdom, regardless of one's biological gender. The qualities this relationship cultivates, intuitive knowing, heightened sensory awareness, compassionate connection, and holistic perception, represent precisely the balancing energies our fragmented, externally focused modern consciousness most desperately needs. As we witness the gradual rehabilitation of cannabis in modern society, reclaiming its connection to the sacred feminine offers a crucial missing piece: the understanding that this plant may serve not merely medical or recreational purposes, but potentially as a catalyst for restoring balanced spiritual awareness, in which feminine and masculine energies complement rather than compete with one another. The transformation of cannabis from revered sacrament to demonized substance represents one of history's most deliberate and systematic campaigns of spiritual suppression. This shift didn't occur naturally or accidentally, but through carefully orchestrated efforts spanning centuries, a calculated war against not merely a plant, but against the forms of consciousness and spiritual autonomy it facilitated. The earliest documented attacks on sacred cannabis use emerged with the spread of monotheistic religious systems that sought to eliminate competing spiritual technologies. Around 300 CE, as Christianity gained political power throughout the Roman Empire, imperial edicts began specifically targeting pagan pharmacological practices, a category that prominently included cannabis ceremonies. Church fathers like Tertullian explicitly condemned plant-based spiritual practices as demonic counterfeits of divine communion, revealing the true concern. Cannabis facilitated direct spiritual experiences that bypassed the need for institutional religious authority as an intermediary to the divine. The Synod of Elvira in 306 CE marked a crucial turning point, formally excommunicating any Christians who burned cannabis as incense in their homes, a practice that had continued from pre-Christian European spiritual traditions. What threatened the Church wasn't the plant itself, but its ability to induce visionary states that often revealed spiritual realities at odds with official doctrine. Cannabis didn't merely alter consciousness, it potentially liberated it from institutional control. As Bishop Augustine of Hippo wrote in his anti-heretical works, the most dangerous aspect of plant sacraments was that they led people to believe they can commune with God without the sanctioned channels of the Church. This pattern intensified dramatically during the medieval period. The Inquisition's infamous witch-hunting manual, Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, specifically identified knowledge of cannabis preparations as evidence of witchcraft, stating that certain herbs used by the accused to induce visions reveal their pact with Satan. What modern historians now recognize is that many of these persecuted witches were simply women preserving ancient European traditions of plant-based spiritual healing. The systematic torture and execution of these knowledge keepers effectively severed European culture from its indigenous relationship with cannabis as spiritual technology. In the Islamic world, a parallel suppression occurred despite cannabis's early acceptance in Sufi mystical traditions. As political control consolidated under orthodox interpretations of Islam around the 12th century, religious authorities increasingly condemned cannabis as hashashin, a term eventually corrupted into assassin in European languages, deliberately linking the plant with violence and moral degradation. This linguistic manipulation represented a sophisticated propaganda campaign against the plant's spiritual applications. Sufi masters who continued teaching cannabis-facilitated meditation practices were increasingly persecuted, their teachings driven underground or eliminated entirely. The colonization of India by the British Empire brought Western religious prejudices against cannabis into direct conflict with one of humanity's oldest continuous traditions of sacred plant use. When British authorities encountered cannabis integrated throughout Hindu spiritual practices, they commissioned the extensive Indian Hemp Drugs Commission Report, 1894, to investigate its effects. Despite the report's surprising conclusion that traditional cannabis use was essentially benign and culturally significant, colonial administrators nonetheless implemented increasing restrictions, motivated by what contemporary scholars identify as theological anxiety about indigenous spiritual practices that challenged Christian metaphysical assumptions. The modern culmination of this centuries-long spiritual war emerged in the early 20th century United States, where Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, orchestrated perhaps history's most explicit demonization campaign against cannabis. What's often overlooked in historical accounts is how Anslinger's rhetoric specifically targeted the consciousness-altering aspects of cannabis, rather than merely its physical effects. His testimony before Congress claimed that cannabis created temporary insanity, where users became possessed by delusions of exceptional mental powers, language that precisely echoed ancient descriptions of the plant's spiritual effects, but inverted from sacred to profane. Anslinger's propaganda campaign strategically employed religious language and moral panic, with publications warning that cannabis use led to ungodly thoughts and communion with dark forces, effectively secularizing ancient religious prejudices against plant sacraments. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 represented the legal manifestation of this centuries-long theological campaign against cannabis consciousness, disguised in the modern language of public health and safety. Perhaps most revealing about this systematic suppression is how consistently it targeted cannabis, specifically for its effects on consciousness, rather than its physical properties. While tobacco and alcohol, substances with demonstrably more harmful physical effects, remained legal and even celebrated in Western culture, cannabis was singled out precisely because it alters perception and changes how people think, the very qualities that made it valuable in spiritual contexts. This wasn't coincidental, but reflected deep theological anxieties about forms of consciousness that transcended culturally enforced limitations. The suppression extended beyond legal prohibition into cultural programming. Throughout the 20th century, entertainment media consistently portrayed cannabis users as confused, paranoid, or intellectually diminished, a characterization dramatically contrary to how cannabis consciousness was understood in traditional spiritual contexts as clarifying, revealing, and wisdom-enhancing when properly directed. This deliberate inversion of the plant's traditional reputation served to disconnect modern people from understanding its potential spiritual applications. What this historical pattern reveals is that the war against cannabis was never simply about a plant or its chemical properties, but about who controls access to certain states of consciousness and the spiritual insights they potentially reveal. As religious scholar Houston Smith observed, the suppression of visionary plant sacraments has consistently coincided with the consolidation of authority in religious and governmental institutions that claim exclusive rights to determine spiritual truth. The contemporary rehabilitation of cannabis thus represents not merely a shift in drug policy, but potentially the restoration of access to states of consciousness that have been systematically suppressed for centuries. States that traditional wisdom suggested might facilitate more direct perception of spiritual realities than institutionally mediated doctrine. Among the most remarkable yet least explored connections between cannabis and spiritual consciousness lies in the work of Edgar Cayce, the renowned American mystic whose extraordinary psychic readings spanning the early 20th century continue to influence spiritual seekers worldwide. While mainstream discussions of Cayce's work rarely highlight his insights on cannabis, a careful examination of his extensive readings reveals profound understandings about the plant's relationship to human energetic systems and spiritual development, insights that remarkably parallel ancient wisdom traditions while adding unique perspectives relevant to modern consciousness. Cayce, often called the sleeping prophet, for his ability to access expanded states of consciousness while in self-induced trance, delivered over 14,000 documented psychic readings addressing everything from medical diagnoses to the spiritual nature of reality. Among these vast archives, a small but significant collection specifically addresses the energetic properties of what he sometimes called the Indian hemp, or simply referred to through circumspect language necessitated by the prohibitionist era in which he worked. In reading number 445, given in 1933, Cayce described cannabis as that which may establish in the sensory system a vision of that which is transpiring in other realms of consciousness. This seemingly simple statement contains remarkable depth when unpacked. Unlike the recreational perspective that views cannabis as merely inducing pleasant sensations or altered perceptions, Cayce suggested it temporarily adjusted the human sensory system to perceive realities already existing but normally filtered out by ordinary consciousness, what he elsewhere called the thin veil between worlds. Particularly significant were Cayce's insights regarding cannabis's interaction with what contemporary energy medicine identifies as the human biofield, or aura. In reading Dana 263-13, he described how certain cannabinoid compounds affect specifically the etheric body, that sheath which exists between the purely physical nervous system and the spiritual energies animating the physical form. This understanding of cannabis as operating at the interface between physical and spiritual dimensions offers a sophisticated framework for understanding its effects that transcends simplistic biological models while aligning with traditional perspectives that recognize the plant's effects on subtle energy bodies. Cayce provided specific technical details about cannabis's energetic mechanics that demonstrate remarkable parallels with Eastern perspectives while adding unique insights. In reading Thumpsha 378-16, he described how certain cannabis preparations temporarily suspend the limiting influence of the pineal body's regulatory function upon consciousness, allowing awareness to extend beyond its ordinary boundaries. This corresponds precisely with both ancient Vedic understandings of cannabis as temporarily lifting the veil of Maya, illusion, and modern neuroscientific investigations into the pineal gland's role in modulating conscious awareness. What distinguishes Cayce's cannabis insights from both ancient traditions and modern science is his detailed mapping of its effects across multiple levels of human energy anatomy. In several readings, he described cannabis as potentially activating what he called the 7th, 9th, and 11th centers of the body's spiritual energy system, centers not typically included in standard chakra models, but which he associated with higher spiritual functioning. These activations, according to Cayce, could facilitate temporary access to what he called the Akashic records, or universal consciousness, a vast field of information normally beyond ordinary perception. Perhaps most relevant to contemporary spiritual seekers was Cayce's nuanced perspective on the potential benefits and risks of cannabis for spiritual development. Unlike both prohibitionist perspectives that demonize the plant and overly enthusiastic proponents who present it as a spiritual panacea, Cayce offered balanced insights. In reading Chartre 543-9, he observed that cannabis could serve as a means for opening channels to higher vibrational fields, but emphasized that these openings could admit both constructive and challenging energies, depending on the individual's overall spiritual development, intention, and energetic protection. Cayce specifically addressed what modern users might recognize as the phenomenon of cannabis-induced anxiety or paranoia, but framed it in spiritual terms. In reading 281-24, he explained that these uncomfortable experiences often resulted from the premature expansion of consciousness into realms for which the entity's energy system has not been properly prepared or aligned. Rather than indicating the plant itself was harmful, Cayce suggested such experiences revealed areas where spiritual development work was needed, what he called shadows brought into the light of awareness. Of particular significance were Cayce's insights regarding cannabis and what contemporary spiritual teachers would call spiritual bypassing. In several readings, he cautioned that while cannabis could temporarily facilitate expanded awareness and spiritual insights, these experiences needed to be integrated through disciplined spiritual practice and actual life changes to produce genuine evolution. In reading Dashka 4:16-7, he warned that repeated use without corresponding development of the spiritual faculties through meditation, service, and purification could create illusions of advancement while actually impeding true spiritual growth. The parallels between Cayce's cannabis insights and quantum physics concepts emerged decades before such connections became popular in spiritual discourse. In reading 294-136, he described how cannabis could temporarily shift human consciousness from particle-based perception to wave-based perception, allowing awareness to function less locally and more non-locally. This remarkably anticipated later scientific discussions about consciousness, potentially operating according to quantum rather than purely classical principles. Cayce's readings also addressed the relationship between cannabis and dream consciousness, a connection recognized in many traditional cultures but largely overlooked in contemporary discussions. In reading Thamran 4:16-18, he described how cannabis affected the transition zones between waking and dreaming states, potentially enhancing what he called the soul's natural processes of symbolic communication and integration. This offers a framework for understanding why many users report enhanced dream recall and symbolic awareness during periods of cannabis use. What emerges from a comprehensive study of Cayce's cannabis-related readings is a sophisticated, energetic understanding that bridges ancient wisdom, modern science, and practical spiritual development considerations. Neither condemning nor naively celebrating the plant, Cayce presented cannabis as a powerful catalyst for consciousness expansion that carried both opportunities and responsibilities, a tool that, like all spiritual technologies, demonstrated results proportional to the wisdom, preparation, and intention with which it was approached. The relationship between cannabis and altered states of consciousness represents perhaps the most significant yet least understood dimension of the plant's spiritual potential. Beyond recreational pleasure, or even medicinal applications, lies cannabis's remarkable capacity to facilitate states of awareness that traditional wisdom traditions worldwide have recognized as gateways to profound spiritual insight, healing, and transformation. Modern neuroscience has begun mapping what ancient traditions intuited, that cannabis interacts with the brain's default mode network, DMN, the neurological system responsible for maintaining our ordinary sense of self and reality. Through its complex interactions with the endocannabinoid system, cannabis temporarily modifies DMN functioning, potentially dissolving the rigid boundaries of ordinary perception. This neurological mechanism provides a scientific framework for understanding what spiritual traditions have long described as cannabis's ability to lift the veil, separating ordinary awareness from expanded states of consciousness. What distinguishes genuinely spiritual engagements with cannabis-facilitated states from casual use is the element of intention, preparation, and integration. Traditional wisdom across cultures emphasize that the consciousness-altering effects of cannabis weren't ends in themselves, but rather means for accessing specific states of awareness with distinct spiritual functions. The Tibetan bone tradition, for instance, identified no fewer than 7 distinct altered states potentially accessible through cannabis, each serving specific spiritual purposes, ranging from energetic healing to direct perception of subtle realms normally invisible to ordinary awareness. Perhaps the most significant of these altered states is what anthropologists studying indigenous cannabis use have termed the witness consciousness, a state characterized by the ability to observe one's thoughts, emotions, and sensory experiences from a perspective of non-identified awareness. This state, remarkably similar to what advanced meditation practices aim to develop over years of discipline, potentially becomes temporarily accessible through properly approached cannabis experiences. In this state, practitioners report being able to observe the contents of consciousness without becoming entangled in them, creating a space for insight, healing, and the dissolution of limiting patterns. The visionary aspects of cannabis-facilitated consciousness have been perhaps the most systematically suppressed in modern discourse. Traditional spiritual systems recognized cannabis's potential to temporarily adjust sensory processing in ways that revealed aspects of reality normally filtered out by ordinary perception. The Zoroastrian Hyoma ceremonies, the ancient Greek Eleusinian mysteries, and indigenous North American traditions all preserved accounts of cannabis, facilitating what they considered genuine visionary experiences, not mere hallucinations, but glimpses of subtle dimensions of reality, normally inaccessible to ordinary awareness. What distinguishes these traditional approaches to cannabis visions from modern recreational use was the sophisticated contextual framework within which these experiences were interpreted. Rather than random or meaningless distortions, the visual, auditory, and synesthetic phenomena arising in cannabis-facilitated states were approached as a symbolic language conveying information from deeper layers of consciousness or non-physical dimensions of reality. Skilled guides in these traditions taught specific techniques for navigating, interpreting, and integrating these visionary experiences as meaningful communications rather than mere curiosities. The relationship between cannabis and dream consciousness represents another dimension of its spiritual significance, largely overlooked in contemporary discussions. Across traditional cultures, cannabis was recognized for its ability to modify the boundaries between waking and dreaming awareness, potentially facilitating states that combined the lucidity of waking consciousness with the fluid, symbolic, and boundary-transcending qualities of dream awareness. Sufi mystics, in particular, developed sophisticated practices using cannabis specifically to induce what they called the waking dream state, a condition of consciousness where divine guidance could be received through symbolic perception while maintaining full awareness. This connection between cannabis and dream consciousness extends to the phenomenon of lucid dreaming, the ability to maintain conscious awareness within the dream state. Multiple indigenous traditions incorporated cannabis into spiritual technologies specifically designed to enhance dream lucidity, using carefully timed consumption protocols combined with specific intention-setting practices and symbolic anchors that would be recognized within the dream state. These traditions understood lucid dreaming not as entertainment, but as a spiritual technology for accessing guidance, healing, and forms of knowledge not available to ordinary waking consciousness. Perhaps most significant for contemporary spiritual seekers is the potential relationship between cannabis and what contemplative traditions call unitive consciousness, or non-dual awareness, states characterized by the temporary dissolution of the sense of separate self and the perception of fundamental interconnection with all existence. While advanced meditation practitioners may develop access to these states through years of disciplined practice, properly approached cannabis experiences sometimes facilitate temporary glimpses of this unitive awareness, characterized by profound peace, expanded compassion, and the direct perception of an underlying unity behind apparent diversity. The key distinction between spiritual and recreational approaches to these cannabis-facilitated states lies in the element of integration. Traditional wisdom traditions emphasize that temporary glimpses of expanded consciousness became spiritually valuable only to the extent they were integrated into ordinary awareness through disciplined reflection, application in daily life, and ongoing spiritual practice. Without this integration, Even the most profound cannabis-facilitated insights remained merely interesting experiences rather than catalysts for genuine spiritual development. This understanding points toward what might be called an ecology of consciousness, a balanced approach recognizing that different states of awareness serve different functions within a comprehensive spiritual life, just as natural ecosystems thrive through diversity rather than monoculture. Human consciousness potentially functions optimally through the interplay of various states rather than remaining fixed in ordinary awareness. Cannabis, approached with proper understanding, potentially serves as one catalyst for temporarily accessing complementary states of consciousness that contribute to a more complete spiritual ecology. The contemporary rehabilitation of cannabis thus offers not merely a shift in substance policy, but potentially the restoration of access to states of consciousness that have been systematically suppressed for centuries, states that traditional wisdom suggested might facilitate more direct perception of spiritual realities than those available to ordinary awareness alone. As modern seekers increasingly approach cannabis with spiritual intention, rather than merely recreational motivation, these ancient understandings of the plant as a potential ally in consciousness exploration find new relevance in addressing the spiritual challenges unique to our time. What emerges from this exploration is the recognition that cannabis, like all spiritual technologies, demonstrates results proportional to the wisdom, preparation, and intention with which it is approached. Neither inherently sacred nor profane, the plant potentially serves as a catalyst that amplifies existing consciousness, revealing both wisdom and confusion, clarity and distortion, depending on the container of understanding within which it is held. In this light, the most important factor may not be the plant itself, but the consciousness that engages with it, reminding us that in spiritual matters, the quality of awareness we bring to any practice ultimately determines what we receive from it. If this exploration of cannabis's sacred history has illuminated something new for you, take a moment to subscribe to this channel for more hidden spiritual knowledge that mainstream sources won't reveal. Your journey of awakening deserves quality information that transcends superficial narratives. Drop a comment sharing your own experiences or questions about the spiritual dimensions of plant consciousness. Your perspective contributes to our collective understanding. Remember, wisdom that isn't shared becomes trapped energy. Subscribe now, activate notifications, and join a community of seekers uncovering ancient truths in modern times.